everyone, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. I'm Frater Eleftheria, and a few days ago I went to see the new Odyssey film by Christopher Nolan. And I'm going to talk about a specific part of that film in this video. This is not intended to be a review or an analysis of that film, but there was one very obscure reference that I picked up on in the film that perhaps other people have missed, but it is a potent reference which opens up a whole can of worms in terms of spiritual significance within Western spirituality. And that's what I'm really going to focus on tonight. Before I go into more detail about that, my overall thoughts on the film. Look, when I saw the promotional material and the trailers, I didn't have high hopes for this film. I thought that it was going to be deliberately disrespectful to a treasured story of Western civilization. And, you know, let's face it, Hollywood has got a track record over the last decade or so of doing just that, of being deliberately disrespectful to culturally important stories such as this. So I wasn't holding out high hopes at all. And then the first reviews started rolling in, and it became apparent that that appearance of the film was very superficial, and the actual film was very different. So far as there were cultural issues touched upon, they actually turned out to be used in a very different way to how they were presented. And in fact, it wasn't like a propagandistic political film at all. It just told a good story, which is what movies are supposed to do, what people still expect movies to do. And although it was certainly political, it was not just cheap propaganda. It was exploring deep societal issues and very poignant questions, and doing it in a very thoughtful and mature way. And there are a lot of symbols and themes within the movie that do have very, very deep cultural implications and social implications. And what the theme or the symbol that I'm talking about tonight is one of those. So what am I talking about tonight? I'm talking about a statue which is described in the story of the Trojan War, a statue known as the Palladium. Now, a quick note about classic texts, which are the source of the story of the Trojan War. The most well-known source of the story is the Iliad by Homer. However, the story of the Trojan horse, which is the famous story within the greatest story of the Trojan War, doesn't actually appear in the Iliad. It comes from other texts, such as the Little Iliad and the Sack of Troy. The events that I'm covering are discussed primarily in the Little Iliad. I'll also be touching upon events covered in the later Roman text by Virgil, known as the Aeneid. Long story short, the legend of the Trojan War and the events following after it has evolved out of many different texts written down during classical Greek and Roman times. Now, the Palladium is essentially a statue of Athena. And so now perhaps you can see what I'm referring to, where there's very quick flashbacks at a couple of points in Christopher Nolan's Odyssey, where the Greeks are storming into Troy after the Trojan horse has gone through the gates. I'm sure that's not a spoiler. It's a very well-known story in our society. And anyway, they're going through burning Troy, and in the course of the destruction, there's this statue of Athena that has its head cut. And accompanying this scene, there is a woman who's very distressed, who's been seized by the Greek soldiers, who, without spoiling too much, is clearly associated with Athena. What I recognized here was a reference to a very important part of the story of the Trojan War, which is not very well known. And that is the story of a statue of Athena that does appear in the account, and which the Greek soldiers, including Odysseus, do have interactions with. And that statue is known as the Palladium. Now, this Palladium is a very powerful relic. It's not just an object infused with spiritual power. It is like the spear of destiny, in that whoever possesses it, it brings great blessings upon and great spiritual power, which translates into political power. And by tracing the travels of the Palladium through its history, we get a history actually of the rise of Western civilization. And one of the spiritual events that is most monumental to the founding of, in particular, Roman civilization, which will become the basis of much of Western civilization today. So, one little statue of Athena that appears in a couple of brief scenes actually has a very, very important story to tell. So, where does the Palladium come from? First of all, what is it? Well, it is a statue of Athena, the goddess of wisdom, as I've said. But more than that, it's a piece of wood which has the likeness of Athena, but hasn't actually been carved by human hands. So there's something a bit supernatural seeming about its coming into being in the first place. And according to myth, this Palladium, this wooden statue with the likeness of Athena, actually fell from the heavens to the earth and was then used to actually found the city of Troy. So you think about how ancient the story of the Trojan War is. It was so deep into our legendary past that we didn't even know if Troy was a real place until very recently. Now think about how ancient in time it is for that city of Troy to be founded. That is the origins of the Palladium. And so the founding of Troy involved this Palladium, and the Palladium was seen as a token of spiritual protection. The goddess Athena was giving her protection to the city so that it would be free from invasion, so that they would be prosperous, and so forth. In the lead up to breaching the walls of Troy, there's years of not being able to break through. The Greeks are looking for ways of turning the tide of the war in their favour. And Odysseus learns of this Palladium, this relic within the walls of Troy, which is giving spiritual protection to the city. And Odysseus hatches a plan with another hero, a Greek hero known as Diomedes. And the two of them sneak into Troy and they steal the Palladium and take it back to the Greeks. By doing that, they actually removed Troy's spiritual protection and removed the favour of Athena. And actually it's said in the legend that Athena favoured Diomedes, and that's why she allowed him to take the Palladium. And then after that, the fortunes of Troy quickly turn, and that's when the Trojan horse is let through the gates, and the rest, as they say, is history. Diomedes was an awesome figure in the account of the Trojan War, very underrated. Everybody knows about Achilles, everybody knows about Odysseus, but no one knows about Diomedes. But he was incredibly goated. He was such a good warrior that he actually fought against two gods on the battlefield in the Trojan War, Aphrodite and Ares, and he injured both of them, and they were so badly injured that they actually fled back to Olympus. How many mortals are there who have injured the gods like that in combat? So, and then the story of the Palladium shifts from Odysseus and Diomedes to just Diomedes. The most accepted account of the myth is that Diomedes ends up with the Palladium, and then he travels back to Argos after the Trojan War is over and the Greeks have won. But because he had injured Ares and Aphrodite in the Trojan War, the gods are offended, or at least Ares and Aphrodite are offended. And Aphrodite takes revenge on Diomedes by causing his wife to take a new lover, and then she starts to plot against Diomedes to take his life once he's returned to Argos. So Diomedes needs to flee. Even though he's the king of Argos, he needs to flee from that life-threatening situation, and there's also an uprising against him. So Diomedes flees Argos across the sea with some of his men, and he takes the Palladium with him. And Diomedes eventually lands in Puglia in southern Italy. And so Diomedes became a very important cultural figure within Puglia, that particular northern region of Puglia. And that's actually the reason why I learnt about the story of Diomedes and the Palladium in the first place. Because I've spoken about the ancestry research that I've done over the last few years, looking into the things that my ancestors believed in the distant past. And of course, my family originally comes from Puglia in Italy, on one side of the family. So that exploration led me to uncovering the story of Diomedes. If you've watched my channel for a while, you'll know that there's quite a few different ancestral stories that I've come across as I've explored my family history. And this is one of them. So when Diomedes arrives in Puglia, he forms an alliance with the Daunian tribes, and he marries the king's daughter, and he's involved in some battles in favor of them, and then is rewarded with land. His men are rewarded with land as well. And Diomedes goes on to found a number of different towns within that region of Apulia. And one of these towns was Luceria, which is where he housed the Palladium that he'd brought with him. And this is actually the town that some of my family comes from. And the cult of Diomedes was very prominent in that region of Puglia. He was seen as a protector of that particular region. He was seen as an inspiration, and his story was seen as an inspiration. And the people of Luceria, which became Lucera, were at one time the community that gave a home to the Palladium itself. Other local legends in different parts of Greece tell different stories where they claim that they had the Palladium, but that they're not considered as credible as this other story. So Diomedes has the Palladium, and then eventually Aeneas comes to Italy to meet Diomedes. Aeneas was another figure in the Trojan War. He was a hero on the Trojan side. The legends say that he eventually took possession of the Palladium. And Virgil's account, which is considered the most authoritative, says that Aeneas came to Italy to meet Diomedes. They reconciled their differences. They weren't fighting each other anymore. And then Diomedes gives the Palladium to Aeneas, and Aeneas leaves. There is a other alternative account of this story, which is that Aeneas took the Palladium directly from Troy to Italy, and that Diomedes only managed to steal a fake version of it. But this version of the myth isn't as satisfying to me, because how could Troy lose its blessing from Athena if it's just a fake Palladium that got taken out? But anyway, Aeneas ends up with the Palladium, and then he travels deeper into Italy, and then he eventually founds a city called Lavinium and becomes the progenitor of the Roman people. And he's considered the ancestor to the members of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which would give us the Caesars. And he's also considered the ancestor of Romulus and Remus. Romulus, of course, went on to found the city of Rome, become Rome's first king. And eventually, as part of the legacy of Aeneas, the Palladium made its way to Rome, where it was housed in the Temple of Vesta by the Vestal Virgins as one of a number of sacred relics known as the pledges of empire. And so these were talismans which were meant to give some kind of spiritual power to Rome, which then gave it some kind of political legitimacy as well. And also this idea of Rome being a spiritually protected city by the gods, much as Troy was when they had the Palladium. And then eventually in the 300s AD, the Palladium was moved again, this time by the Emperor Constantine, who moved it to Constantinople. And so that again was symbolic of a political shift in power. And apparently the Palladium was housed under the column of Constantine. And so this relic played a part in the founding of Western civilization, and it was considered a symbol which legitimized Western civilization, or at least Roman civilization, with divine favor from the gods. And so this is a very charged symbol indeed. To bring this back to the Odyssey, the movie, was Christopher Nolan's allusion to this powerful symbol of the Palladium intentional? I would be surprised if it wasn't. I'd say that everything in Nolan's films is quite intentional and thought out, even if the reference seems obscure. And so the way that this symbol, this statue of Athena, is treated in the movie has got a message behind it. And this is something that I want to explore as well. Is Christopher Nolan trying to give us a message which ties into the story of this very ancient and important symbol? And I think that he does. But you have to look at the way that the statue of Athena is dealt with in the Odyssey film. So one striking difference is, well, it's a completely different statue for one thing. The statue of Athena in the Odyssey is like a stone, it looks like a sandstone statue or something like that. And then the other key difference is that the statue is not stolen, it's actually beheaded by the Greeks. Now, this in itself is wildly out of character for the Greeks. They would have paid respect to the images of the gods. They would not have done something as foolhardy as defacing an image of Athena like this. And in the act of stealing the statue, they weren't actually disrespecting it, they were just taking the god's divine favor away from other human beings. So this is far from faithful to the original story. But what is Christopher Nolan trying to say here? I think it would be wrong to look at the movie as just a retelling of the Odyssey and bits of the Iliad. I think that there's a specific message in there for today's audience as well, for our own times. And I think the way that the statue of Athena is treated is part of that message. So what does it say that the statue of Athena is not stolen and treasured by the Greeks, but actually defaced? What is that saying about the way that we have treated our own culture and our own cultural legacy as the West? Something has gone wrong. We have disrespected our past in some way, in a way that is so severe that it will incur the wrath of the divine. That is my interpretation of that. And there's a few hints about what that might have been, where that might have begun for us in today's time. The first hint, I think, is the fact that the statue is beheaded like that. That's not something that's characteristic of any Western country today. On the other hand, it's very common for groups like the Taliban or the Mujahideen to go in and destroy sacred statues of other cultures. But what's that got to do with us? Well, in a way, the West created the Mujahideen. The West created the Taliban by financing them so that they could fight against the Soviet Union. And so, through the West's mistakes in things like the way it's meddled in the Middle East, we have ultimately disrespected the very founding principles of our civilization. And, you know, the fact that this is tied into the storming of Troy and, you know, the way that civilians are targeted and all of that is very reminiscent of the wars in the Middle East as well. Is Christopher Nolan trying to say that along the way, in that period of our history, the West somehow lost its soul? And are we still being haunted by the consequences of those events? I mean, look at what's happening in Europe right now with all of the issues that are coming up with people coming from different parts of the world and things being disrupted because of that. Where do a lot of those people come from? They come from Syria, fleeing a country that was destabilized largely because of the actions of America in Iraq. But maybe that's just my reading. Maybe I'm just reading too much into things. There's certainly other things which have debased Western civilization, which have nothing to do with the wars in the Middle East, that Christopher Nolan could have been referring to as well. But whatever the mistake is that we made, it seems to, in Nolan's telling, it seems to revolve around the abandoning of the law or rule of Zeus, which is hospitality to strangers. What isn't as clear in the film is that law is actually reciprocal, but there is this theme of like this general breakdown of that hospitality and that goodwill and that trust between different people, and it's stemming from some mistakes that were made by the Greeks. So there's a lot of different ways you can think about it, and there's a lot of different references that encourage us to think about the themes picked up by Nolan. And one of those is the way that he uses this image of Athena. I think that it encourages us to think about the Palladium. It encourages us to think about where we've come from as a civilization, the founding principles of Western civilization, and think about our history, the good and the bad, and think about the principles that we want our society to be based on, and whether we have started to abandon any of those. But anyway, it's a great film, and there's lots of other little historical and mythological Easter eggs within the Odyssey. I'm sure there'll be plenty of other people talking about it, so there'll be plenty to think about. But I hope you enjoyed this video on the Palladium and its significance. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe to my channel to support my work, hit the notification bell so that you get notified of my future videos, hit join or thanks to support me further. Come see me at EnochiaCon. There's a link to that in the description below. I'm still selling my book. I'll leave a link to that in the description below. And of course, please do join my mailing list. I'll leave a link to that in the description below as well. But thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.